Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank you, Ferencváros Institute, for inviting me to this very important conference. I would like to thank you for giving me the chance to speak in this forum, and please forgive me my actual status of my voice. The topic of my speech is freedom of conscience and religion in private schools. Having several minutes, I plan my speech to consist of the following parts: introduction, historical outline, outline of sources of law, the subject and object of this freedom in the context of activities of private schools, selected case law, and of course general conclusions. Introduction. Freedom of conscience and religion is included among the fundamental human rights. We can enjoy it in various aspects and at a different stage of life. Education, which can take place in both public and private schools, is also of basic nature. It is worth mentioning here that in the famous case of Lauzi versus Italy, as part of the exchange of arguments of the parties, the issue of presence of religious symbols in public school was raised, leaving private schools on the margin of this dispute. However, can this issue really be limited to the public school only? Are private schools already extraterritorial in this aspect? What are the limits of a possible restriction of this freedom in private school? This issue can also be approached from the other institutional side, considering what a possible restriction of freedom of private education looks like with respect to freedom of conscience and religion. It is worth paying attention to the list of individual rights and their possible gradation. On the one hand, freedom of conscience and religion in the individual and institutional aspect, and on the other hand, the right to education. At the same time, it should be remembered that from the perspective of the European legal culture, both the above mentioned freedom of conscience and the right to education are highly ranked and protected. At this point, it should be noted that this lecture is only a contribution to discussion and aims at organizing and reasoning of arguments around the above problems. And now, historical outline of education and freedom of conscience and religion in Europe. The issue of freedom of conscience and religion in private schools is, of course, not a novelty. It should be remembered here that both the freedom of conscience and religion and the right to education are issues that have been shaped for centuries and in a very similar subjective and objective scope. It is worth paying attention to the historical perspective first. The organized form of education appeared in antiquity and it was usually private, for example, the Platonic Academy. Also, since antiquity, the idea of religious freedom, legally sanctioned in the famous Edict of Milan the Law, after the fall of Roman Empire, these were Christians who created and organized a system of education in Europe. Therefore, it was unified, for example, by requirement to use Latin. In the Middle Age, the first universities appeared as the most organized element of education in the system that was secondary to the Catholic Church. It is worth mentioning that in previous centuries there were schools founded by religious associations, which could have been attended by persons of other faiths. For example, Gymnasium Bonarum Artium, founded in Raków, Poland by the Arians in 1602. The postulate of a universal education system developed during the Enlightenment period, and the school system created by the church was being abolished at that time. The slogan of a secular school was one of the assumptions of some models of secular states, and at the same time limited freedom of conscience and religion, at least in the institutional aspect. The desire to reduce or even eliminate private education can also be seen at the later stage in history. During the Communist period, the functioning of private schools in Central and European Europe was contrary to the political assumption of the time. Along with the fall of a communist regime, a general process of law normalization took place in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, under which the freedom of conscience and religion was restored and guaranteed in a broad sense, including the right to establish and run schools. In this way, the centuries-old achievements of religious communities in shaping the education system were appreciated. The Catholic Church concluded many concordants guaranteed its rights to run schools, including universities. And conclusion to this part of my lecture, considering the above, it can be concluded that the provenance of education is private, and the private education should be given a natural place in a pluralistic education system with due respect for autonomy and independence of religious communities running such institutions, and on the other hand with respect for the freedom of conscience and religious in individual aspect. As already indicated, one can notice a great influence of religious associations on the development of the education system. The historical aspect of the freedom of conscience and religion and the right to education are very similar. The constitution of modern European countries often refer in their preambles to the Christian heritage and traditions, which is important inter alia for historical and functional interpretation of the regulations. Outline of sources of law protecting freedom of conscience and religion in the context of private schools. So, freedom of conscience and religion is now recognized in so many normative acts. The right to education is also guaranteed at similar levels in hierarchy of sources. It is worth remembering that in the states with the rule of law, however, the law is preceded by an axiology recognized in the society. It consists of different values that relate to each other, and their gradation can be observed. The value of freedom of conscience and religion ranks high in the hierarchy of values. For believers, eternal life is often more important than even mortal life itself. As confirmed by the European Court, freedom of thought, conscience, and religious is also a value for atheistic, agnostics, and people indifferent to faith. The sense of the high value of education is also widely accepted in Europe. Freedom of conscience and religion is also widely protected by international law, both universal and European. Considering the above, it can be concluded that the freedom of conscience and religion in the individual and institutional aspect is broadly guaranteed by normative acts in the European legal culture, starting from the Constitution through multilateral and bilateral international agreements and sub-constitutional acts. It may be limited only based on strictly defined conditions. Moreover, this freedom is included in the basic human rights, which is important for its interpretation in relation to the right to education. The subject of this freedom. Considering the sources of the law guaranteed freedom of conscience and religion, the subjective aspect of freedom of conscience and religion in the context of the activities of private schools can be considered at various levels. In the first place, this freedom is granted to the individual since man has conscience. In the case of individual, this freedom can be compared with the right of the entity running a private school and other students. The believer can exercise his or her freedom of conscience and religion at school, individual aspect. Moreover, man has the right to organize himself or herself into groups and to express his or her faith also collectively and create religious communities. This freedom is granted also in the institutional aspect. Freedom then will concern the possibility of establishing a private school and running it by a religious community. Moreover, this freedom is enjoyed by non-believers and legal persons who also have the right to establish private school. It can be concluded that religious freedom, which is weighted in many subjective levels, both in an individual and institutional aspect, may refer to activities of private schools. The object of this freedom in this context. The objective aspect of freedom of conscience and religion in the context of activities of private schools seems to be more complex than its above discussed subjective aspect. It can be concluded that the subject of freedom of conscience and religion in the context of functioning of private schools is complex. Exercising this freedom is full or even partly may be confronted with other rights, not excluding the freedom of conscience and belief or religion of others. Therefore, one cannot formulate a single pan-European answer in the form of a general prohibition of expressing religious beliefs in such a school, for example, wearing a traditional religious symbol, or unlimited religious freedom. In general, in the European legal culture, issues related to religious freedom very often remain to be settled on a case-by-case basis by judiciary. It seems that the key to resolving such disputes is to first try to assess the gradation of individual values in a specific case and then use principle of proportionality of restrictions. And now some general conclusion from case law. So from the perspective of European legal culture, it seems that the judgments of European court have the greatest range of impact due to the number of states that have ratified the convention. It can be concluded that such judgments are an example of complex nature of the issue of the relationship between the freedom of conscience and religion and the right to education in private schools. This issue requires the use of multi-phased interpretation and an appropriate and individual hierarchy of recognized values and right protecting them. There is no definite answer for every case. It seems, however, the starting point should be the freedom of conscience and religion with respect to the gradation of values. In the jurisprudence of European Court, we can find the need to maintain a proper balance between individual right is emphasized. And general conclusions. Legal orders of various states may relate to the issue of freedom of conscience and religion in private school. In this regards, one should respect one's own constitutional law based largely on the European legal culture, but also on international law, including the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, which has competent jurisdiction in this respect. The issue of freedom of conscience and religion in private schools can be approached both from the individual and institutional perspective. There is no simple answer as to which of these aspects are paramount in every possible case. Therefore, dispute resolution should be approach on individual basis, and the values protected by law should be weighed in the context of given dispute. In Europe, as shown as the case of Lao Tzu, there are generally not too many law or judgments relating to the use of religious symbols or teaching religious in public school. And at the end, it is therefore possible to postulate on the lege ferenda basis for the specific norm to be included in relevant status or even acts of a higher rank, which would directly determine the generally formulated freedom of conscience and religion by guaranteeing them to everyone in any type of the school. So, thank you for your attention.